Hey, hi, and hello. It is 40 Leaf Clover, and boy howdy am I excited to play Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. At the time of recording, we're less than 2 months removed from its release date, and I am stoked. You see, Fire Emblem Three Houses is far and away my most played Nintendo Switch title. It has so many things going for it that I can only hope are carried over into a sequel, or maybe prequel? Or maybe both, if time travel is actually a relevant plot point. Seriously, the soundtrack, the designs, the characterizations, I could go on and on. And thankfully, from what the trailers have shown us, the upcoming title looks to be delivering on all these fronts. Not to mention, even more content seems to be coming our way this time around, like dungeon exploration similar to what I believe Fire Emblem Gaiden implemented. And the main draw is that there are 4 distinct routes. Fortune's Weave, more like 4 houses, am I right? Up top. By the way, I'm hashtag Team Theodora. Where are my supporters at? Seriously, I saw a poll for what route everyone was picking first, and Theodora was in dead last. But I get it. All of these characters are radiating main character energy, and as such, are worthy of being rallied behind. It's a wonderful problem to have if you're struggling to choose. But that brings me to my main concern. Just because they're all starting off on the right foot, will these 4 characters feel equally fleshed out in the long run? I have to ask because, despite holding 3 houses near and dear to my heart, even I can admit that the balance is heavily lopsided in favor of one route. Simply put, the developers, be it Intelligent Systems or Koei Tecmo, had an obvious favorite child out of the 3 leaders. If you don't believe me, allot me a few minutes to present my case. Also, in order to fully break down the scenario, I'm going to have to dive headfirst into spoiler territory, so take that as your first and final warning. Alright, without further ado, please hear my claim as to why the developers clearly wanted you to side with the Blue Lions. Some of you may be surprised to hear me say that Dimitri is number 1 in the hearts of those who created this game. A few of you, I'm sure, would have guessed that I would be talking about Edelgard right now. And some of you may have thought I was going to talk about Claude, but come on, unless you're Joe Zija, you know you're wrong. No shade by the way, Joe, I too fear the deer. And I hope I said your name right. But seriously, Edelgard is set up to be both the hero and the villain, isn't she? The entire conflict occurs at her command in every route. The only distinction is if you've chosen the Black Eagle House and can decide whether to follow her into war or fend her off in the name of Saros. Everything revolves around her in the narrative sense. For crying out loud, even the main theme of the game is sung from her perspective. So yeah, she is the focus on the base level. But here's the thing. Anyone can be a driving force. But it takes an even more special someone to derail that momentum and usurp them from the spotlight. And as someone who chose Edelgard's route first and prefers Crimson Flower overall, even I can admit that Dimitri is living in that limelight. But don't you worry, dear viewer, I can assure you that he didn't do it alone. He had the help not only of his peers, but of his creators themselves. First, let's talk about the Blue Lions supporting cast. Do I think this is the best class of the game? No, I'd personally choose the Golden Deer for their vivid personalities and designs. However, the Fargus residents do have a leg up over those from the Leicester Alliance. If I were to describe these students in one word, it would be connected. Let's consider the relationships between everyone. The only lone wolf here is Ash because he's removed from all others. Annette and Mercedes, however, share a deep bond after having attended the School of Sorcery, or whatever it's called. Dedue, meanwhile, owes his life to the Prince, an irreplaceable bond that's not seen in any other students. Finally, there's the Royal Quartet. Dimitri, Sylvain, Ingrid, and Felix have known each other since childhood. They may as well all be siblings, ignoring romantic ties, with how close they are before the game even begins, regardless of what the lack of starting supports may say. The strength of the connections already formed between the students, in my opinion, gives the player an easier time connecting Byleth to their pupils. Now, let's compare this to the other houses. The Golden Deer are a joke in this regard. You've got Ignatz and Raphael, who have a friendship before heading to Garreg and Leonie knows Geralt from her past, so I guess that helps conduct an understanding between her and the player. But no one else knows each other. Okay, yes, the nobles have passing familiarity of the other founders of the Alliance, but it's not like Hilda and Lysithea grew up together. There's no comparison with the Blue Lions. Heck, Claude, the house leader, just rolled into Fodlan to lay his claim to controlling the Leicester Alliance a mere tick prior to enrolling at the academy. It's ridiculous. And the Black Eagles don't fare much better. Bernadetta is a recluse who has no ties, while Dorothea only has a one-way knowledge of Ferdinand. I believe Caspar's and Linhart's fathers might have a relationship, meaning these two probably have a passing understanding of the other's existence, but I wouldn't consider them close or anything. They really only talk about their fathers beating each other up. How touching. Petra is a prisoner of war. That outright disqualifies her in my book. The only connections present exist between Edelgard, Hubert, and Ferdinand. The latter two hate each other, by the way. It simply presents a barrier to entry to caring about these characters. Not that it's impossible to learn to love these lemmings, but I feel as though a lot of people would rather take the path of least resistance and choose the house that already feels like a home. Then, as if that wasn't enough love heaped onto them already, the creators moved the hand of fate to intervene and make the story all about the Blue Lions. Now you may be confused about this statement, as the plot, as I've previously described, is about Edelgard declaring war on the church. However, despite the overall summary, it's impossible to ignore the individual story beats presented to the player. Let's cover the first few chapters of Part 1. The first 2 chapters aren't much worth mentioning, as they don't have links to any specific characters, being the house scrimmage and routing of the bandits. Costas, as far as I can tell, has no ties to anyone aside, of course, to Edelgard, who hired him to wreak havoc. By the way, can we talk about that for a quick minute? Edelgard, while disguised as the Flame Emperor, tasked the bandit to attack her on the road, and then he almost kills her if not for Byleth's intervention. How stupid does that make Edelgard look in retrospect? Congratulations, you almost played yourself. Just imagine a Three Houses story where Edelgard dies in the prologue. You just hang out and chill at the monastery while those who slither in the dark scramble to recuperate. Anyway, this is where the missions were given and characters who join the cast get real lopsided real fast. The next chapter sees us taking down Ash's adoptive father. We're also introduced to Catherine, a resident of Fargus who has, surprise surprise, met Dimitri when he was younger. Next shows the Dark Mages attempting to steal the sword of the Creator and who happens to be there but the Death Knight. Granted, we're not supposed to know this yet, but he has ties to Mercedes, being Yaritza, her younger brother. Finally, we have to deal with Miklon, and wouldn't you know it, that's none other than Sylvain's brother. Why are we only getting missions that create dramatic tension for the Blue Lions? And as if that wasn't glaringly obvious enough, you get a green unit this mission, and look at that, it's Gilbert, the estranged father of Annette. Not to mention, unrelated to the mission itself, but do you know who starts bebopping around Garreg around this time? Go ahead, guess. Did you remember correctly? It's Felix's father, Rodrigue. Seriously, if they're from Fargus and have a pulse, they're appearing at some point in Part 1. Now, let's be fair and discuss who from the Adrestian Empire shows up to represent the land of the Black Eagles. Oh, wait, I can't think of any. Unless I'm mistaken, and I don't have time to currently replay and remind myself you're actually watching old B-roll footage, there's no one that gets brought up to center stage. You could say Monica/Cronia appears after Flame is kidnapped, but I count her toward the Agarthans, and in my opinion, they exist in their own bubble, as Edelgard is begrudgingly working with them. At best, you could count the guy who's robbing the ancient tomb when Edelgard reveals her identity as the Flame Emperor, but he's so insignificant to the scene, battle, and overall story that I can't even remember his name. Really, I'm blanking here. It starts with an M, but that's all I got. And it's not like the Golden Deer fare any better. I believe there's one, count them, one appearance. Remember when I mentioned Rodrigue debuting? Well, Judith replaces him on the Golden Deer route. Woohoo. Does that even matter though when, according to the wiki, she has Fargus blood running through her veins as well? And other than her, I don't think there's a single case requiring even an asterisk like with Monochronia. Funnily enough, there's a meme in the community with how many times Hilda mentions her brother Holst without him ever making an appearance. It kind of makes me wish that he didn't show up in Three Hopes so that the meme would persist. Anyway, all that to say there's a significant bias towards the blue characters at the beginning of the game. Now, in an effort of fairness, I will bring up that more Adrestian and Lester/Almiran supporters appear in Part 2, while Fargus doesn't really expand their cast. Yet I'd argue that they don't make as much of an impression on the player. Really, they don't add much to the overall narrative, more so being background elements which bolster the forces of their respective leaders. Honestly, what role does Nadir play if not just to be a warm body that opposes those who Claude opposes? And I'm not done with part 1 yet, oh no. Firstly, I need to bring up cutscenes. Would you believe me if I said that the Blue Lions get the most amount of cutscenes? Okay, I don't know if that's actually true, but it feels true. What gets me is the interjection of a conversation with Dimitri en route to the Goddess's Tower. Here, he reveals the backstory between himself and Edelgard. This does tick me off a bit as Edelgard, who represents half of this dynamic, mentions their relationship a total of 0 times. Also, surprise, Dimitri grew up with yet another student not even in his house, so he gets an additional connection outside of Dedue and the quartet. Yippee! Plus, can I bring up the fact that if you're planning to rendezvous with Dimitri in the tower, this cutscene kind of ruins that? What, are you just going to walk 5 feet apart toward the tower without speaking and then still act surprised whenever you meet there? It's nonsense. Additionally, when Edelgard reveals herself as the Flame Emperor in Black Eagles, you have a bog standard segment where the characters are all A-posing, doing nothing but talking to one another. Yeah, Rhea gets mad, but what emotional impact does that really have? Golden Deer isn't anything worth mentioning either. You fight the Flame Emperor, she gets unmasked, and all you get is Claude essentially saying, "Whoa, didn't see that coming." You might as well cue the laugh track to go with it. Blue Lions, however, gets yet another unique cutscene where Dimitri mentally snaps and starts killing people indiscriminately. It's cold, it's disturbing, and it makes you feel something that the other routes cannot hope to achieve. And secondly, let's discuss paralogs. If you don't remember what they are or ignored them outright, paralogs are the side missions focused on a specific character or characters to give the player a little more insight into their development. Completing these side stories will net you some goodies in the form of weapons, battalions, etc., but the trade-off is that they're time sensitive. Now, this is the part where I should say that you needn't worry yourself. They don't affect the story, but that wouldn't be the truth. You see, for almost all of the paralogs, they can be skipped and no one will bat an eye. But did you know that there's one specific paralog that actually does impact the narrative? And while most paralogs can be completed on multiple routes due to the required students and or staff being recruitable, this one particular paralog is only able to be completed on one specific route. Would you like to guess which? Who am I kidding? This far into the video, you already know it's Blue Lions exclusive. This is a Dedue paralog about saving his fellow Dusker fighters from being routed. The reason you won't be able to finish this paralog on other routes is that Dedue is ride or die with Dimitri, meaning he can't be recruited into other houses. Side note, this is where I would bring up Hubert and Hilda as the other examples of retainers, but Hilda for some reason is perfectly willing to leave Claude for your team if you're playing Blue Lions or end up in Silver Snow. Way to be loyal, Hilda. This paralog affects part 2 because Dimitri becomes a prisoner of Cornelia and is set to be executed, but will be rescued by Dedue. Depending on if you did the side story and saved some Dusker warriors, Dedue either will or will not have backup and will determine whether or not this rescue is a suicide mission. You heard me right, if you don't complete Dedue's paralog, he won't make his daring return in part 2. The creators decided that you would be punished with an emotional gut punch for not putting as much attention into this route as they themselves did. It kind of works in their favor either way, to be honest. You either get to keep your retainer, or you get reminded of the true horrors of war and get more emotionally invested in Dimitri's plight. It's a win-win for the Azure Moon storyline. And speaking of Azure Moon, let's finally get to part 2 of the narrative. As a refresher, this takes place 5 years after the beginning of Edelgard's war against the Church. When they awaken, they return to Garreg Mach in search of their house leader, whom they promised they'd reunite with in time for a very special anniversary that was to take place at the monastery. Well, the monastery itself is pretty much destroyed, but a promise is a promise. And lo and behold, the house leader is actually there. This is where the bias seems to present itself once more. You see, aside from wardrobe updates, Edelgard and Claude really haven't changed as characters. Yes, they're older and are now the leaders of their respective lands in Fodlan, but other than that, Edelgard is still a troubled girl who relies on her teacher, and Claude is still a sneaky strategist who keeps his cards close to his chest. Dimitri, however, has changed. If you go down the Blue Lion route, then you know the house leader as a well-to-do student who may have some trauma in his past, but is attempting to handle it without the modern convenience of therapy. However, once that mask slipped off Edelgard, Dimitri's own mask peeled away to showcase the demons hiding beneath the surface. 5 years later, and Byleth discovers that the demons have taken over. Dimitri is a case study of the archetypal flawed protagonist. Simply put, he's either dealing with severe mental illness or is actually haunted by the ghosts of the past. I lean toward mental illness, but seeing as there may actually be ghosts in the story, as we'll discuss later, I have to present both potential scenarios. In either case, that's quite the burden to lug around, and it compels you, the player, to sympathize with him in a way that the other house leaders, set it if you're playing Silver Snow, can't elicit. This negative aura then carries through the duration of the first half of Azure Moon. The plot follows the general gist of Gilbert and the gang making reasonable battle strategies and Dimitri being too driven by his assumed guilt and grief to follow suit. Instead, chasing revenge against Edelgard, the one he presumes killed his family and has ergo created a symbol of what's between him and hopefully ridding himself of the ghouls he's dragging around. It's a flawed sense of reasoning, but as he's the king, Byleth and the others must heed his distorted whims. This path continues onward, even to the point where the gang reunites with Rodrigue. Felix's father, being the right-hand man to the former king Lambert, is entrusted with guarding the hero's relic, Ariadbar. Dimitri becomes the one true wielder of this weapon, given that he is the last of the royal house. Now, you can debate whether or not Dimitri earned the right to draw this spear and lead the charge onto the battlefield at this particular point in the story. He's still blinded by his bloodlust, but at the very least, it's difficult to debate that this isn't a start to his redemption. He's burdened by the concept of his father's disapproval, yet here he is receiving what is essentially the ultimate blessing from the late king. If you don't consider it growth, you should be willing to agree that it's a first step on the journey toward growth. Now, compare this scene to how Edelgard receives Emir and Claude receives Failnaught. Or don't, because they don't have scenes in which they get their respective relics. These are important weapons, come on! I suppose I can understand why they just have them come part 2. The issue is that the weapons don't really contribute to the development of their owner's characterizations. Neither the axe nor the bow bestows a new path upon the other royals, so there admittedly wasn't a need to show the viewer the acquisitions. But if anything, that only widens the gap between the significance of the narratives on display in the separate routes. Between Emir and Ariadbar, there's a clear winner in terms of which exclusive route serves its story purpose better. And you may be confused with why I just mentioned 2 of the 3 relics when talking about exclusivity, specifically leaving out Failnaught. Well, there's a simple explanation for that, dear viewer. You see, Failnaught is given to you in Azure Moon 2. Claude, when finally confronting Dimitri in a later chapter, just hands over Failnaught to the new king, ridding him of one of the few opportunities to have appeal for his own route. And note that there's a perfect opportunity for this scenario to occur in Crimson Flower as well. Edelgard defeats and corners Claude, allowing the player to decide whether or not to kill the Alliance leader. Either way, you could receive the bow, save him and earn it as a gift, or kill him and pry it from his cold dead hands. Take your pick. But no, you don't deserve the extra relic, only Dimitri does. Fun fact, according to the wiki, Azure Moon is the only route where all heroes' relics are obtainable aside from Amir. How about that? Maybe it's because the developers were fawning over the Blue Lions throughout crafting the game. And maybe it's because Dimitri earned his promotion. Like I said a little while ago, Bar is either a development of character or sign of things to come. Well, during the battle on the bridge of Murden, Dedu returns to join your camp, as previously stated. Now, granted, as also previously stated, you don't necessarily have Dedu here depending on if you ignored the prayer log, but I'll keep going on in the assumption that you did save him because that seems to be the intention of the creators. So, back to the plot, I think seeing Dedu essentially come back from the dead flips a switch in Dimitri's head. Nice rhyme. Someone whom he believed to be a ghost has been resurrected and is now capable of telling the king face to face that he'll still follow his lord into the gates of hell, even though he missed the Valley of Torment by one chapter. I personally believe that this is the second most important story beat for Dimitri, because while it ultimately takes Rodrigue's death and dying words in the next chapter for Dimitri to accept all that's happened, it really sows the seeds that he's the man in charge now and has ever loyal followers that need him. Thus, before the next chapter begins, he automatically promotes from High Lord to Great Lord, the ultimate class for Dimitri's story. I would wager that this class was initially deemed King before the developers decided to reuse a class from older titles. Either way, the new class and outfit really solidify the notion that Dimitri's trials and tribulations are culminating in a fully fleshed out character. And hey, it's everyone's favorite game! How do the other routes compare? Well, while both Edelgard and Claude get auto-promotes in their respective roads, it doesn't seem as though there's plot relevance to them. I mean, yes, Edelgard becomes the Emperor, but that already happened way back in Part 1. This didn't resemble growth at this specific point in the tale, it's just there. At least, I don't really recall relevance with this upgrade. Same with Claude. What does he learn, or how does he change that merits his promotion to Big Dragon Guy? I really can't say. It seems to simply be another point in Azure Moon's favor. As a final note toward the plot of Azure Moon, I now turn to its finale. So, I could mention the meeting between Dimitri and Edelgard, where they decide that there will be no reconciliation between parties, but I already brought up how we learned about their missed connection type relationship during the Part 1 discussion. Really, it just boils down to Dimitri and Edelgard understanding that they do care for one another, but that one of them will ultimately have to die. The new concept present at the end of this route is Hegemon Edelgard. You see, the Empress of Adrestia is an antagonist present in every story save for Crimson Flower. So, if that's the case, I have to ask, why does she not resort to her Agarthan transformation in any other battle? I get that they wanted a unique final boss for Azure Moon, same as how Verdant Wind gets Nemesis, but that logic falls apart given that Rhea becomes the final boss no matter what path you take the Black Eagles down. I understand that the game was allegedly rushed toward the end, so it makes sense why there's similar chapter objectives, but it does sour the idea that Blue Lions deserve their own version of Little Miss Fressvelg. Narratively, it doesn't make sense that Edelgard wouldn't pull out all the stops when facing Rhea or Claude. She seriously faced death at their hands and decided to hold back? Pardon? It makes Azure Moon feel like it's getting special treatment for the umpteenth time. And finally, even outside of the blue route, Dimitri and Pal still get additional props. Well, mostly. You see, in Verdant Wind, Dimitri is killed off screen. Hilda details his downfall, but it kind of falls flat nonetheless. However, all is not lost because Dedu is here to save the day. Woohoo! He arrives in Inbar before Claude and Co. Zerg rush the capital with adequate battle plans, which prove pertinent to their success. Now, in Silver Snow, Dimitri also dies, what a shock, but he won't stay gone, oh no. Remember way back when in this manifesto whenever I discussed that ghosts may exist in this universe? You do? That's awesome, thank you for paying attention. Anyway, after we lose the Lion King yet again, Byleth has a scene where they either dream of or are visited by a specter Dimitri, who laments that he couldn't fulfill his quest and ultimately find his way. Whichever interpretation you may have of this encounter, we can agree that it's relevant screen time beyond his route's confines. Lastly, if you choose Crimson Flower, Dimitri suddenly has a 180 on his character. He's completely lucid for some reason, so as to remain threatening. You see, having a flawed protagonist works because he can start as a raving lunatic and shed that persona over time. But with an antagonist, you don't necessarily have the connection with, nor the time allotted to said villain. So a cold, calculating persona commands a stronger presence, in my opinion. Plus, he has both eyes for some reason. That means he can have one eye on you and one eye on the game. All that to say, you're getting Dimitri appreciation regardless of the route you take. Okay, rant over. I hope this didn't come across as too negative, because I'm approaching this topic from a place of love. Fire Emblem Three Houses is one of my favorite games of all time, and I'm so hyped for the next installment in the Sothis verse. That being said, I'm not blinded by nostalgia for the first entry. While I could gush about its positives for an equally long amount of time, I have to admit that Three Houses presents a real favorite in terms of determining a main character in a nearly objective manner. Dimitri is clearly the true protagonist out of the available options, no matter how much it pains me to say as such, being an Edelgard stan. I mean, come on, he's the fan favorite for a reason. The player is given every opportunity to love him at every available turn. If I hadn't started with Crimson Flower as my first playthrough, I have no idea what my stance on the character would be. But, seeing as how the chips fell where they did, and I got more of an outsider's perspective on the character, I can step back and notice how much promotion went into this particular development. And while I appreciate it, I feel as though the promotion was to the detriment of the other lords. Simply put, Edelgard doesn't feel as fleshed out as Dimitri, and Claude doesn't even feel as fleshed out as Edelgard, which is exactly what I'm concerned about in Fortune's Weave. My biggest hope for the game, aside from the presentation, the soundtrack, or even the gameplay, is that the characters are given an equal amount of the spotlight. Will this be true? Who knows? Kai kicked off the reveal trailer, so he could be the real protagonist. Or perhaps Lita or Theodora was developed first and will have the bulk of care given to her route. Maybe Dietrich is the key to the plot, since he has the strongest ties to Fodlan. It's a toss-up at this point, and I suppose only time will tell. But those are my 2 cents, or more like $2 at this point, on Intelligent Systems' history with character development in this universe, and how I hope it will change moving forward. That's all from me today, thank goodness. This script is nearly 5,000 words long, so I'm exhausted. But if you've made it to the end of my ramblings to hear this, then it was well worth it. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for joining me. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a like, and sound off in the comments. Do you agree that Dimitri is the main character of Three Houses? Or are you convinced that Edelgard takes the honor at the end of the day? And if Joe ZJ ever sees this video, let me say to you, I give you alone permission to say that Claude is the true protagonist. And finally, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. Any support you're willing to offer would really mean a lot. Until next time, take care everybody.